Sergeant James Doakes, the only person at Miami Metro who never bought into Dexter Morgan's act. While everyone else saw Dexter as a harmless, socially awkward forensic expert, Doakes always felt something was off about him. Right from the start, he distrusted Dexter and wasn't afraid to show it. Unlike his co-workers, Doakes didn't just laugh off Dexter's weird behavior. He noticed things that didn't add up. The way Dexter never seemed surprised by crime scenes, how he was too calm in intense situations, and how he always found himself in the middle of things. Doakes had spent years as a cop and in the military, and his instincts told him that Dexter was hiding something big. As time went on, Doakes' suspicion only grew stronger. He started watching Dexter more closely, following his movements, and digging into his life. What he found made his worst fears come true. In this video, I'll show you exactly how and when Doakes discovered that Dexter was a serial killer. We'll break down the key moments that led Doakes to the truth and why he was the only one who saw through Dexter's mask. From the very first season of Dexter, it was clear that Sergeant Doakes had a problem with Dexter Morgan. While most of Miami Metro either liked Dexter or ignored him, Doakes never trusted him. He didn't know why at first. He just had a gut feeling that something was wrong. Doakes was a seasoned cop with a background in the Special Forces, and his instincts were sharp. Unlike his co-workers, who saw Dexter as awkward but harmless, Doakes picked up on things others missed. Dexter never reacted like a normal person. He didn't show fear, surprise, or even much emotion at all. When everyone else at a crime scene was disgusted or disturbed, Dexter remained eerily calm. And more than once, Dexter seemed to know things before he should have. One of the first big red flags was how Dexter always seemed to be one step ahead. He arrived at crime scenes unusually fast, sometimes before dispatch had even put out a call. Doakes also noticed that Dexter had an almost unnatural understanding of murderers, sometimes describing a killer's mindset too accurately, almost as if he were speaking from experience. Doakes couldn't let go of the feeling that Dexter was hiding something, but at first he had no proof. All he had was instinct, and that wasn't enough. But instead of ignoring his suspicions like everyone else, Doakes leaned in. He started watching Dexter, calling him out in public, and testing his reactions. The more he pushed, the more convinced he became. His mistrust turned into full-blown suspicion when he noticed Dexter sneaking around outside of work. Dexter had a habit of disappearing at odd hours, and his excuses never quite made sense. That's when Doakes decided to follow him, determined to find out what he was really up to. And that's when things really started to unravel. Once Doakes was convinced that Dexter was hiding something, he wasn't going to let it go. He started keeping a much closer eye on him, following him after work, watching his movements, and looking for anything that would prove his instincts were right. At first, Dexter was careful. He had spent years perfecting his double life, making sure he didn't leave any loose ends. But Doakes was just as determined. He knew something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to stop until he figured out what it was. One of the biggest turning points came when Doakes followed Dexter one night, hoping to catch him doing something suspicious. Dexter noticed he was being followed and managed to lose Doakes before getting to his kill site. But that only made Doakes more determined. He now knew for sure that Dexter was up to something. Why else would he be so good at evading his surveillance? Things escalated when Doakes started digging deeper into Dexter's past. He found out that Dexter had a traumatic childhood, that his biological mother had been murdered, and that he had been adopted by a cop. While none of this was proof that Dexter was a killer, it painted a picture that made Doakes even more suspicious. It also explained why Dexter was so good at covering his tracks. He had been trained by a cop. The real breakthrough came when Doakes broke into Dexter's apartment while he wasn't home. He searched through his things, looking for any kind of evidence. And then he found it, the blood slides. Dexter kept small slides of blood as trophies from his kills, a habit he picked up as part of his ritual. To anyone else, they might have looked like scientific samples, but to Doakes, a trained detective, they looked like evidence. And if they were, that meant Dexter had been collecting blood from crime scenes that the police didn't even know about. Now that Doakes had found Dexter's blood slides, he was no longer just suspicious, he knew. He wasn't sure how many people Dexter had killed, but he had enough proof to connect him to multiple unsolved murders. The problem? Doakes couldn't take this straight to his superiors. He had broken into Dexter's apartment without a warrant, which meant the evidence wouldn't hold up in court. And without solid proof, no one at Miami Metro would believe him. They already thought he was too aggressive, and many people actually liked Dexter. If Doakes wanted to take him down, he would have to catch him in the act. Doakes decided to go all in. He started following Dexter more and more, even confronting him at work. He would randomly show up at crime scenes where Dexter was working, watching him like a hawk. He also tried to push Dexter's buttons, hoping to force him into making a mistake. But Dexter was careful. He knew Doakes was onto him, and he made sure not to slip up. The turning point came when Doakes finally caught Dexter red-handed. After days of surveillance, he tracked Dexter to a secluded area near the Everglades. What he found was undeniable. Dexter was in the middle of disposing of a body. Doakes pulled his gun and confronted him. For the first time, there were no lies, no excuses. Doakes had caught Dexter in the act, and he knew there was no talking his way out of it. But Dexter wasn't going down without a fight. In a split second, he managed to overpower Doakes, knocking the gun out of his hands. What followed was a brutal struggle, with both men fighting for control. Dexter was a skilled fighter, but Doakes was trained for combat. It wasn't an easy fight, but in the end, Dexter got the upper hand. Instead of killing Doakes, Dexter locked him up in a remote cabin in the Everglades. He wasn't sure what to do. Killing Doakes would go against the code his father had taught him. He only killed criminals, and Doakes was an innocent man. But keeping him alive was just as dangerous. If Doakes escaped, Dexter's secret would be exposed. While Dexter wrestled with this decision, outside forces made it for him. Miami Metro eventually tracked Doakes down, but before they could bring him in, Lila, Dexter's former lover, set the cabin on fire, killing Doakes and destroying the evidence inside. And just like that, Doakes became the perfect scapegoat. Miami Metro pinned the Bay Harbor butcher murders on him, and Dexter walked away free. In the end, Doakes was the only person who saw through Dexter's mask from the start. He was right all along, but his determination to prove it ultimately cost him his life. So conclusion, Sergeant Doakes was the only person at Miami Metro who saw Dexter for what he really was. While everyone else was fooled by his friendly, awkward persona, Doakes trusted his instincts. He knew something wasn't right about Dexter from the beginning, and he refused to ignore it. Over time, his gut feeling turned into full-blown suspicion, and eventually he found undeniable proof: Dexter's blood slide collection. He did what no one else in the department could do. He caught Dexter in the act. Unfortunately, that victory didn't last. By the time Miami Metro found Doakes, he was already dead, framed for the very murders he had been trying to stop. Ironically, Doakes' determination to expose Dexter is what led to his downfall. If he had backed off, he might have survived, but that wasn't who he was. He was a cop, a soldier, and a man who always followed his instincts, no matter the risk. In the end, Doakes was Dexter's greatest threat, and for a brief moment, he came closer than anyone else to bringing him down. But Dexter, as always, found a way to escape. And that's the story of how Sergeant Doakes knew Dexter was a serial killer, and how that knowledge ultimately cost him his life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos of your favorite shows. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.